Okay, hey everybody, welcome. This is our first presentation for video 301. This is Grapevine, Anatomy, and Physiology. If you would like to read along in the textbooks, this is chapters 5 and 6 from General Viticulture and chapter 1 from the Grape Grower's Handbook. I'll try my best to reference in all my presentations what the textbook reference material was for you guys. So for those of you guys that are new coming back to school and to college, this might be a little overwhelming. For those of you guys that have a science and like specifically biology background, this is going to be a piece of cake. But there's no prerequisites for this class, so this is just a really good starting point to get everyone on the same page and really understand the grapevine. So with that being said, if it's very overwhelming for you, take advantage of this video, pause it, rewind it, rewatch it, check out any of the additional source material I have linked in the slides, and it'll be okay, right? If you need help, just feel free to reach out, right? So we're just going to do a very general overview of the grapevine. The textbook went into much more details about specifically grapevines and some really interesting facts about how these things change throughout the season. So like the differences in these cells between spring, with bud break, and harvest with fall, and then even the dormancy in the wintertime. So if you're interested in learning about those specific transitions, look into the textbook, but we're just going to cover a very general, broad scope today. So we'll do a little intro on the grapevine. We'll talk about cells and tissues, grapevine anatomy, and also grapevine physiology as well. So part 1, grapevine anatomy. So intro to the grapevine. Oftentimes, especially for me coming from the winemaking side of the industry, it's really easy to see the vines as just like these things that exist and they just do their own thing and we just harvest the fruit when it's ready, right? But plants are very complex. They're living, breathing organism, and they have lots of complex systems, right? So because they're rooted to their ground, their sensors, their mechanisms are really triggered by like light and heat, pest pressures, soil moisture, minerals, and much more. So that those are like the eyes, ears, and mouth, right? And like nose of the plant is all these other signals and all these other defense mechanisms they have put in place and how they respond to the environment. So altogether, grapevines and all plants can be broken down into their respective structures. So cells, tissues, and structures. So starting at the cell, it's the plant cell, which something that really defines the plant cell versus the animal cell. One of those characteristics is having a cell wall. So cell wall is the outermost part of a plant cell. It's a support skeleton. It's a barrier against infection. It's also very strong and withstands osmotic pressure of the cell. So osmotic pressure being like all the liquids in the cell. There's a lot of high pressure on that. It's just keeping that all cased in very nicely, right? So just a couple of the very basic things inside of a plant cell. We have our nucleus, which stores genetic information, DNA for reproduction, right? We have the chloroplast, which if this was a colored cell chart, this would be green, right? So chloroplast contains chlorophyll. That's what makes the plant green, and that's where photosynthesis also takes place, right? Then, so that's the part where we generate energy from light, right? So then we have the vacuole, which can take up to 90% of the total cell volume. That's this big contraption here in the center of this diagram. It's a trash can. It holds a lot of dissolved compounds in water. It's also known as cell sap is what it's also kind of like known as. So this can be a large part of the plant cell. And then we also have the mitochondrion, which is the powerhouse of the cell, of course, where energy is created to power the cell's activities, right? So lots of cool things there. I also have a plant cell video here if you guys would just like a quick review about the cell and the parts how they're involved and what they do. You're not going to be quizzed based off of this video. This is just additional learning material. You will be quizzed on anything that's bolded on the presentation slides. So you'll see it in the student learning objectives at the end. These will all be like vocabulary words for you guys to just know. And I wouldn't ask you to write out the definition on your own. It'd probably be a multiple choice question, a true or false, or a matching question. So just so you know. Okay, so graduating from cells to tissues. Tissues are made of cells, so lots of cells put together that can vary in form and function, right, and shape. So what we have is meristematic tissue. This is a thin layer of actively growing cells that reproduce via cell division. This is responsible for shoot and root growth, so on both sides. I don't have a picture of that here, I apologize, but we do have the cambium layer, which is also responsible for growth. But this focuses more towards the girth of the plant, so it grows outwards, kind of like when you see the rings on a tree stump, right? So that outward growth is thanks to the cambium layer. That's the part that's continuously growing outwards as the plant gets older. So this is specifically where the bark and the wood meet. So if you look at this picture here, we have the bark, which is this outer portion of this cut, and then we have the phloem, which we'll talk about shortly, and then this is the cambium and the wood. So that is where they meet right there. Another interesting fun fact about the cambium layer, it's the only part of the plant that's capable of producing the cells that make a union during grafting. So when you take cuttings from one vine and then graft it onto another, you have to have contact with that cambium layer or else the graft will not be successful. So we learned about that a little bit in video 303, but just for information here. We also have a nice picture of the vascular cambium here, this little red layer, and it does separate the xylem from the phloem, right? And then we also have the cork cambium, that's like the outermost bark of this picture. Cool. So cork and bark, those are synonymous. They're used interchangeably for grapevines. It's the epidermal layer that forms on the canes, arms, trunks, and older roots. As the vine starts to grow and it starts to age, it starts to peel off. That's kind of the process of what happens there. That's why you see all those little dried bark that peels off of grapevines as they age. So wood, in this case, like more specifically refers to the interior of this cut. That is mostly the xylem. So this provides, support for the plant. It transports and stores nutrients for the plant as well. Okay, so we have the cork and the bark, and then the wood is mostly the interior portion there, right? And that's what we're referring to as the xylem. We'll get more into detail in just a moment here on that. Okay, so xylem and phloem, right? We've probably heard about these things before. There's a really nice YouTube link here that up in this upper corner that helped me a lot with telling the difference between these two. So the big things, made two columns for you here to really understand the difference between the xylem and the phloem. So xylem, it's unidirectional. It goes from the roots to the leaves, right? The phloem is bidirectional. So that's just kind of like a freeway system for sugar to get moved to other parts of the plant. Any type of energy, nutrients that needs to be moved around, it's bidirectional, right? Also, the structure is very different. So the xylem is the woody part, right? Think wood. Very thick walls made of lignin, and this is a structural support of the plant and helps the plant stay upright. For the phloem, it has thinner walls. There's no lignin. It's very flexible. And the cells have walls with perforations that go through as well. We'll see a picture in the next slide. We'll go over this again. The location of the xylem is in the inner side of the vascular bundles, and the phloem is on the outer side of the vascular bundles. So we'll talk about that in a moment too. So xylem and phloem, it's one way, right? Water and minerals. This is just a completely hollow tube. These are very thick walls, and they're very stiff, right? The phloem has these little like sieve slits here too, these little walls. It's a two-way flow. It's water and food, and they have these little perforations here, right? So here's like another really good example. So this whole section, this whole woody part, these rings, this is xylem. This is all xylem, it's all support, it's all water transfer for the plant, right? And then at this layer between the xylem and the phloem, we have the cambium layer. So you can see that's exactly where the woody part ends and the bark starts to show. And this outer bark and this is bark, but this inner bark is phloem, right? So when you talk about grapevine or even plant girdling, That's when they take a rope or some kind of cutting tool and they girdle the plant. So think about like a girdle in reference to fashion and females, right? The things that kind of tighten around your waist. Thank God we don't have those that much anymore. But it's the same thing with the plant too in a vine, right? So the girdling will cut through the phloem and it will actually restrict the nutrients that that plant is getting. It can be strategic, but it also can be detrimental to a plant, and that's how a lot of plants can actually die. You cut them off from all their nutrients. They need both, for sure. And these rings are also just a really good example of yearly growth from the cambium. That's the growth as the outward girth of the plant, too. Cool. I think that covers everything I wanted to say about that. Yeah, definitely check out that video if you'd like to get another explanation of that. Okay, next on tissues we have the epidermis, right? So if you're familiar with that word, it's like the layer of your skin or the outer layer of the plant too, right? It's a protective tissue that's composed of one to several layers of flattened cells, forms surface covering the leaves, shoots, fruits, and young roots, right? So this is kind of a cross-section of a plant epidermis. This is most likely the leaf. We have like the cuticle, the upper epidermis, lower epidermis. There's a bunch of cells within this epidermis. And then here at the bottom we have the guard cells, which are the openings or the hoops that open the stoma. And so multiple stoma is called stomata, right? And of course within this we have like all of these like palisade cells, mesophyll, and all these other things. You won't be quizzed on this. Again, just focus on the words in bold here on the side. So cutin is waxy. It's a waxy waterproof substance that thickens the outer walls of epidermis cells. That helps to protect it. And then we have stomata. So stomata are really important because they help the plant take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen as a byproduct, right? And so that's part of the process of photosynthesis, right? And then we also have water regulation. So it can help control water loss through transpiration, where water vapor exits the plant. We're going to talk more about photosynthesis and transpiration here in just a moment. Okay, next we have grapevine anatomy. So we have the trunk here. So this is the main component of the vine. The trunk consists of both the scion and the rootstock. So it contains both of those things. The scion is the upper portion of the grafting union, and the rootstock is the lower portion of the grafting union. If you're not familiar already, like most grapevines across the world are grafted. There are portions of the world that don't have grafted grapevines, but most of them are. And we have to use American rootstocks because we have this wonderful thing called phylloxera, which is this louse that will eat up your roots. And so American rootstocks are really the only ones that are resistant to this louse and can protect the grapevine. So that's why we have to graft most of them. And then the upper portion are European grapevines. These are the ones that produce the best fruit for the best quality wine, traditionally speaking. So that's the difference there. Then we have the head. So this is the central part of the vine where the cordons branch off. So we'll talk about during our pruning demo the difference between a bilateral cordon, which is like cordon is cord in Spanish, or you can think of it as an arm, right? So we refer to it as arms or cordons, however you would like to refer to that for yourself. This is the part of the vine that holds the canes or shoots, right? But when we go into our pruning segment, we'll learn the difference between head-trained and bilateral cordon-trained vines. That all refers to where the shoots come off of. Okay, canes and shoots. So the difference between a cane and a shoot is that in the springtime, when it's still green and it's still flexible, it's a shoot. As it starts to mature and it starts to develop into the fall and then winter months, it starts to lignify. The lignin develops, it becomes hard and woody. That's when it becomes a cane. So a shoot and a cane. It's a stem that will grow leaves, develop fruit, and be pruned back every year. So it just depends on time of season, but canes and shoots are the same thing. Okay, renewal spur. Here we go. So this is the piece that's left after pruning, which new shoots will grow off into the spring season, and it will look like this, right? So this is the winter, and then this is after pruning, and this is like before pruning. This is what these look like with these buds. Okay, the bud is a massive tissue that contains an entire shoot and the berry set for the new season. So these, when these sprout, they'll become these lovely shoots with leaves and more buds and tendrils on them too. We also have the internodes, which are between the buds. There's a node at the bud, and then there's the internode. So that's the reference. That's the vocabulary for that. Okay, awesome. So yeah, be prepared for any of those bolded words, and it's most likely just going to be a question where it's the same exact picture. Just be prepared to identify what these positions are. Okay, next we have grapevine physiology. So physiology is the branch of biology that deals with the normal functions of living organisms and their parts. So the way in which, organisms or their parts function, right? So these are just very basic, right? First, we'll start with transpiration. So transpiration is the process. You can think of like transpire, think of like sweat, right, in people. So transpiration in plants is when plants lose their water vapor through these small parts called the stomata, right? We talked about the stomata back here, right? These are in the leaves, mostly in the lower part, underside of the leaves, right? So sunlight causes evaporation to happen, right? It comes from the leaves, they evaporate, but then the difference in pressure forces the water to be pulled up through the xylem and continue to move towards the leaf, and that will actually coincidentally pull from the roots as well. So it creates this thing called transpiration pull. Let me see if I can move my presentation here so you can see that. Sorry, my big head's in the way. There we go. Transpiration pull. So the traction force that pulls water and nutrients from the roots to the leaves of the plant, right? So another way to think of it too, you could kind of argue which one comes first, right? Is it the evaporation from the leaves that makes the transpiration pull, or is the water first absorbed through the roots? So ultimately, this is the cycle, but what occurs first, this was the chicken or the egg, right? So water is absorbed by the roots, travels through the xylem, upwards towards the leaves. Water plays a role in photosynthesis and other cellular processes. Water evaporates from the moist internal surfaces of the leaf to the air spaces within the leaf, and then water vapor diffuses out through the stomata, right? And the reason that the stomata are open is because they're taking in gas for photosynthesis, right? Cool. Okay, so stomata. What's stomata with you? We have a nice little link here to an article, Nutrition in Plants. So again, these are the tiny cells that are tiny openings that can be found on the surface of leaves, typically mostly the bottom. It's also a little bit on the stems and other plant organs too, depending on which plant you're talking about. So they have these things called guard cells, which I mentioned slightly earlier. So these are like, you think of them as like pool rings or like inflatable tubes, right? These guard cells are specialized and they open and close at very specific times. So when they take up water, the water fills those guard cells and they inflate. And as they inflate, they open the stomata. And then when water depletes and the plant needs to preserve its water reserves, they actually deflate and they flatten out and they close that stomata. So it's very cool how that mechanism works. They control also the entry and exit of gases. So entry of carbon dioxide, exit of oxygen and water during transpiration. They'll also mostly open in the daytime for gas exchange and then close at night to preserve water. Cool. Okay, photosynthesis. Most folks have heard about the process of photosynthesis. It's the process where plants take in carbon dioxide and water, then they use solar light energy to convert that into sugar and oxygen, right? So it's how plants are generating energy reserves through sunlight during the daytime, right? So photosynthesis and transpiration work together to create energy for the plant, right? Because, yeah, they just work together. Okay, next is water intake by the roots. So the roots, very familiar with roots, right? All plants have roots of some kind. So these roots, as they start to project out, they have these very tiny finger-like segments on them called root hairs. These little tiny guys here. So this helps to increase the surface area for which they can touch the soil. It works with water and mineral absorption, and it takes place on specialized cells via osmosis. This is a nice image of a root tip. Roots are always actively growing, so the plants are always growing downward and up and outward at the same time. The larger the plant, the more water reserves it needs, right? So as it's getting larger and larger, it needs more and more water to sustain its life. So it'll keep going deeper and deeper as far as it can go. And that can be manipulated in viticulture to either limit the growth if you want to develop really deep roots. It can lead to longer living vines potentially. There's a whole theory and process for root development, soil depth, water reserves and all that stuff. So we'll get more into that as the semester goes on, but just covering the basics today. So that's how roots work, right? But as it's growing, we have the root cap and then the apical meristem region. This is like the meristematic cells are the ones that are always growing. This is where cell division happens, and then elongation is here, and then differentiation, right? So now we have cells that are becoming specialized, creating root hairs, vascular cylinders, and much more, right? Cool. So again, if that's really overwhelming for you, you can just focus on the bolded words on the side here. Cool. So osmosis, if you don't know osmosis, it's a very nice process. It's the diffusion of water through a selectively permeable membrane from an area of high water potential to an area of low water potential. So how do we dissect that? We have a photo here in the corner, and what we have is we have water on both sides, and we have a concentration of something, right? It could be a mineral, it could be sugar, it could be anything. This is just an example. But the similarity between all these examples is that it's a water solution, right? So what we have is you have a semi-permeable area of contact, which would be the soil versus the root, right? And there's water in the soil, assuming. So what's happening is we have a concentration of a substance here is much lower than the concentration of substances here. So see, there's only a couple green dots on this left side, and then lots of green dots, much, much more. It's highly concentrated in these green dots, right? So what happens is naturally through a semi-permeable layer, hence the root, is water will travel towards the higher concentration. And so it'll do that so it can even out the concentration on both sides. So now there's approximately, these little green dots are at the same concentration than on this side, right? The ratio of water to green dots is now the same on both sides. So water moves on its own through a process called osmosis. We see this a lot in like cells with like sugar and salt and other things, but that is the process for water absorption in the roots, or at least one of them. Okay, next we have respiration. So respiration is the opposite of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, I like this picture here. Photosynthesis typically happens throughout the day, right? It requires light energy to work, and it's the process of taking light energy and creating energy reserves through sugar. It takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen, right? When the sun sets and all your stomata close and the plant is changing, its metabolism is changing. Now it's taking that sugar, that energy that it made throughout the day, and it's breaking it down to do metabolic activities in the plant. These are important for like growth, repair, production of the plant, right? It's breaking all those things down, And it's taking in oxygen to do that and consuming that sugar. And then carbon dioxide is actually an output of that as well. So sugar that was produced during photosynthesis and oxygen turns into carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So it's the exact opposite of photosynthesis. So that's all you really need to know on that. Okay, lovely. And then we have our learning objectives. So this only a couple dots here, but just all you need to know is identify the vocabulary words that are bolded, explain the difference between xylem and phloem, identify the grapevine anatomy that we went through, and then just be prepared to briefly explain the process of photosynthesis, transpiration, respiration, water uptake by roots, and the stomata. So that should hopefully not be too bad for you guys. I feel like I kind of blasted through this presentation, but if you have questions, we'll go through it, and then we will not be having class this Wednesday in person due to our schedule and the wine symposium. But yeah, let me know if you guys have questions. Alrighty.